Welcome to Paskvan Podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps this channel. So today we're going to get into a really extensive analysis. We're taking a methodical look at a set of source documents that detail a decades-long search. A search for an offender who really exploited the margins of both society and technology. And this exploration is tailored for you, the learner, because we want to extract the most critical insights from what was a period of, well, profound uncertainty in the Pacific Northwest.
That's right. Our mission here isn't just to recount what happened, but to really understand how it could happen, how a systematic pattern of acts was able to persist for so long.
Right.
We're going to focus on the systemic weaknesses, the technological limits of that time, and then ultimately on how scientific advancements brought resolution to a case that had gone cold for years.
The sources that we have detail the investigation into the individual connected to the Green River. And it is a very sobering topic. It requires us to look at not just the chilling methods, but also the social context that gave him a kind of camouflage.
A perfect camouflage.
So let's start at the very beginning. Let's try to understand the environment, the region itself, which projected this image of peace, but was quietly concealing some very deep anxieties. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really get it, you have to picture Western Washington state in the early 1980s. The image that was sold to the world was one of just, incredible natural beauty.
Evergreen forests, quiet suburbs, that whole picture.
Exactly. That image of quiet prosperity was right. Powerful. It was the brand.
But that's the illusion, isn't it? The source materials show a really stark contrast. Beneath that calm surface, the region was under some intense economic strain.
Oh, far from it. It wasn't that idyllic picture at all. This was a time when the area's main economic engines were faltering. The aerospace industry, for one, was going through these huge fluctuations.
And that employed tens of thousands of people.
Tens of thousands. So you had these massive layoffs. Skilled workers suddenly finding themselves without a job, or at least seriously underemployed. And at the same time, traditional manufacturing jobs were also just disappearing.
That kind of economic instability, it always has a ripple effect, doesn't it? It tears at the social fabric.
It does. When stable jobs vanish, people have to move. And the records show this significant growth in transient populations, people just constantly on the move, looking for work, looking for a safe place to stay.
And they weren't necessarily people who chose that life.
Not at all. They were forced into it by circumstance. They were drifting between cities, trailer parks, cheap motels, and, often in makeshift shelters hidden away in the woods or along these industrial corridors.
That lack of a permanent anchor, that was a critical factor.
Critical vulnerability.
And this instability, this constant movement, it created the very conditions that the offender would later exploit. The sources are pretty clear about the specific group that was most at risk during this time.
They are. The target group consisted of runaways, young women involved in commercial transactions to survive, and really anyone who lacked a strong support system.
They were invisible.
Socially invisible. That's the core tragedy here. Their lives were lived on the absolute edges of the economy. They often used aliases, had no fixed address, had strained family ties.
Which means there was no one, or almost no one, monitoring their safety.
Precisely. So if one of these young women vanished, the delay in anyone even noticing, let alone filing a report, could be days or weeks or sometimes even months.
And that delay was the offender's greatest asset.
It was his operational window. It gave him this enormous amount of time where he could act and conceal what he'd done long before any official inquiry even began. This lack of scrutiny was probably the single greatest systemic failing that allowed these acts to just continue and multiply.
And the geography of all this centers on the river that gave the case its name. We need to picture the Green River not as some pristine mountain stream, but something else.
No, it's a working river south of Seattle. Its banks are bordered by industrial sites, abandoned buildings, and these pockets of deep, accessible isolation.
So isolated, but right next to everything.
Exactly. A place where someone could pull off the road for just a few minutes, be completely hidden by trees, and then just merge back into the flow of traffic like nothing happened.
And the calm of that whole region was just shattered in July of 1982. The sources are very specific about that first discovery.
They describe a teenage boy out by the river in Kent, Washington. He finds the first body floating near the bank, a young woman partially submerged.
A horrifying discovery. But it was what happened next that turned it into a full-blown crisis.
The pattern emerged almost instantly.
So fast.
Within just a few days, another body was found nearby. Then a third. Suddenly, it was impossible to see them as separate incidents. The Green River had become this horrifying focal point.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of the fear.
So once those initial discoveries were made and connected, law enforcement realized they were dealing with something systematic, something planned.
Oh, the systematic nature was undeniable. The victims all shared these specific vulnerabilities. They were young women, girls, many in their mid to late teens, identified mostly as runaways or involved in street activities.
What's so chilling is that the offender seemed to understand their situation better than the authorities did.
He banked on it. He banked on the fact they used different names, that they didn't have a fixed address. It meant that even when remains were found, the process of just identifying them could take weeks, sometimes months.
So the remains might be found before anyone even officially knew the person was missing.
In some cases, yes. That's exactly what happened.
Let's talk about the method. The sources stress manual strangulation or the use of ligatures. What does that tell behavioral analysts?
It speaks volumes about control and a disturbing kind of intimacy. To do that requires close, prolonged physical contact. It requires an immense level of control over the other person.
This wasn't a distant act.
No, not at all. It was methodical. And the condition of the bodies, found nude or partially clothed, sometimes bound, it suggested a ritualistic element, a desire for total domination.
The locations, the dump sites, are also key to understanding his mindset, right?
Initially, yes. They were clustered near the river, often close to access roads, but still in isolated spots. This suggested a deep familiarity with the geography of the area. He knew the back roads. He knew the quiet spots.
He wasn't some outsider just driving through.
No, this was local knowledge. He knew exactly where he could stop for a few minutes without being seen.
And here's where the analysis gets even more disturbing. The sources point to evidence that he would return to the sites.
Yes, that's a critical behavioral signature. Revisiting the sites, sometimes posing or covering the remains, implies a continuing psychological connection to the act. His need for control didn't end when the person's life did.
It's the mark of someone who is highly organized.
Deeply organized and methodical. Not impulsive. This is calculated. And that made investigators' jobs incredibly difficult because it's so hard to predict the next move of someone they controlled.
As the scope of this became clearer, fear just gripped the whole region.
Absolutely. The atmosphere was thick with terror. Parents were warning their children. The police, feeling this immense pressure, issued advisories for young women on the streets to, stay home.
But that advice completely ignored the reality.
It did. They couldn't just stop. Their survival often depended on being in those areas. It was an impossible situation for them.
And then the media gave it a name, the Green River Killer.
And that name just cemented the terror in everyone's mind. It created this single unified fear, but it also put incredible pressure on a law enforcement system that was, frankly, completely fragmented.
Which brings us to the operational headache, the jurisdictional challenge.
A complete mess.
Yeah.
You have to remember, this is the 1980s. No integrated computer databases. Remains were being found in Kent, Seattle, Des Moines, unincorporated King County.
All with different police departments.
All with different police departments, all relying on paper files, index cards, and phone calls.
So how do they share information? A detective in one city gets a tip.
And a detective in another might have the one piece that makes it all click, but they'd never know. The coordination was so inconsistent, it just slowed everything to a crawl. The paperwork alone was a mountain. The whole response was fractured, and the offender was just moving seamlessly between the cracks.
The crisis finally forced them into an unprecedented solution. The Green River Task Force is formed in 1982.
Yes, this was a recognition that the old way was failing. It was a massive multi-agency effort. They pooled resources from local police, the sheriff's office, state patrol, even federal agents.
The scale of it was huge.
At its peak, you're talking dozens of full-time investigators. And their initial focus was just brute force. They flooded the streets, they interviewed everyone they could find, they used decoys, they ran surveillance.
And they compiled these enormous lists of suspects.
Enormous. The lists eventually swelled into the tens of thousands. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack just kept getting bigger and bigger. And the technology of the era just wasn't up to the task.
The task force had the manpower, they had the will, but as we get into it, the technological reality of the 1980s becomes the real wall they couldn't get over. They were working in the dark.
That is the tragic heart of this part of the story. The biggest handicap was the state of forensic science. I mean, reliable, precise DNA analysis as we know it today. It simply didn't exist as a tool for them,
It wasn't even on the horizon.
decades away from being used in a courtroom.
So what did they have? What could they use from a crime scene?
The tools were so limited. Fingerprint databases were all local, not connected. Hair and fiber analysis was used a lot, but it was subjective. It could suggest a connection, but it couldn't give you that 1 in a billion certainty you need.
And profiling was still a very new field.
Very new. And it relied on these broad, generalized assumptions about how an offender might behave. So what you have are detectives forced to rely on old school methods.
Intuition, witness statements, informant tips.
Exactly. And, as we'll see, the flawed results of polygraph tests. The critical failing, and we can only see this with hindsight, is that they collected the evidence. They preserved the biological material. But they didn't have the tools to read what it was telling them. The clues were there, but they were invisible.
And this technological blind spot was made so much worse by a societal one, the way the victims themselves were viewed.
The sources are very direct about this. These victors came from communities that society was already, inclined to ignore. They used aliases. They didn't have stable homes. When they vanished, the urgency just wasn't there in the way it should have been.
The implication of that is it's devastating.
It suggests a systemic dismissal. If the victims had been from affluent middle-class families, the public outcry, the resources, everything would have been different. The offender, he accurately calculated that society had placed a lower value on their safety.
The investigators themselves had to confront that later on.
They did. They had to acknowledge that this bias gave the offender the time and the space he needed to operate.
And all the while, the perpetrator himself wasn't standing still. He was watching the police. He was adapting.
His actions show a methodical adaptation. As police patrols intensified around the Green River, the remains started appearing in new places, much more remote, harder to find locations, ravines, deep woods, far off the main roads.
So he was actively scouting new sites?
It seems so, yes, responding directly to the investigation's moves. And his concealment methods also evolved. At first, remains were just discarded. Later, we see evidence of burial, of deliberate efforts to delay discovery.
It all points to his patience and control.
He was silent. Never communicated with the media or the police. He wasn't looking for notoriety. He was focused on control. And that made him incredibly difficult to profile.
Which brings us to this pivotal, frustrating moment in the investigation, the early encounter with Gary Ridgway in 1983.
This incident is the perfect storm of all the era's limitations. Gary Ridgway was the picture of an ordinary man, a truck painter at Kenworth, living this unremarkable life. He was remarried, went to church, had a steady job.
And his job put him in the right places at the right times?
His delivery routes took him all over the areas where victims were last seen or where remains were found, but he only came onto their radar because of a tip from his own wife.
She suspected him. That's how close they were.
So close. And when they brought him in, he played the part perfectly. He was cooperative, calm, denied everything. He gave them alibis. And then, because it was one of the few scientific tools they trusted, they gave him a polygraph examination.
And he passed.
He passed it. At that time, a polygraph result carried a lot of weight. Passing that test was like a shield for him. It didn't clear him completely, but it dropped him way, way down the priority list.
So his ordinary appearance and a flawed test essentially diverted the entire investigation.
For years.
Yeah.
Their attention shifted to other suspects. People who failed the test or who seemed more agitated or who just fit the popular movie-style profile of what they thought they were looking for. Ridgway was right there, but the tools they were using failed to see him, and he was free to continue.
So as the years went by, that massive initial effort just ran out of steam.
Ciao.
By the mid-1990s, the case had stalled completely.
You can just imagine the frustration. All those years, all those man-hours, and the person responsible was still out there completely ahead of them. The leads dried up, there was no new evidence, and the investigation just slowed to a crawl.
And Ridgway, what was he doing this whole time?
He was living his life. He'd achieved the ultimate operational security, which was just anonymity. He was a quiet, ordinary man who blended perfectly into his community. His own activities slowed down as well, which meant fewer new incidents for police to investigate. The case went undeniably cold.
It must have been a crushing blow for the detectives who had dedicated years of their lives to this.
It was. The task force was eventually scaled back, and then it was formally concluded. The files were all boxed up, put into storage. Evidence was preserved, but the detectives started to retire, carrying this immense unsolved burden with them. It looked like a permanent dead end.
But while the investigation was dormant, something was happening in the scientific world. A revolution in forensic technology in the late 1990s. And that was the unexpected key.
This is the pivot point for the entire story. Science delivered the solution that all that police work just couldn't. It was the development of reliable, precise, and crucially, legally admissible forensic DNA technology. It changed everything.
Let's break that down. What made this new technology so different from what they had in the 80s?
Well, back then, analyzing biological material was mostly just blood typing. It could exclude big groups of people, but it couldn't pinpoint an individual.
It was very broad.
Very broad. The tech from the late 90s, like SDR analysis, was different. It allowed scientists to take incredibly small, even degraded samples and generate a genetic profile that was unique to one person. The certainty was astronomical.
So all of those evidence boxes, the swabs and fibers they'd so carefully preserved, suddenly they had a voice.
They finally had a voice. The failure in the 80s wasn't in collecting the evidence, it was the inability to interpret it. So quietly, investigators started sending those old preserved samples from the Green River victims for retesting with this new technology.
And they were getting ready to compare those new profiles against that huge old list of suspects.
Exactly. And that systematic reexamination is what finally closed the loop in 2001.
What was that moment like, the moment of the match?
The name Gary Leon Ridgway, the truck painter who passed the polygraph, he was still in the files. They had a sample of his DNA. When they analyzed the genetic material recovered from several victims.
The material they couldn't analyze before.
Right. And they compared it to Ridgway's profile. Yeah. The result was immediate. It was devastatingly clear. An unambiguous match.
So the man who was dismissed for being too ordinary was finally identified 2 decades later by a technology that didn't even exist during his most active years.
The irony is just profound. On November 30, 2001, they arrested him. And the accounts of his arrest say he was calm, almost detached. He had lived this ordinary life for nearly 20 years after the investigation had peaked, hidden in plain sight. Science had finally overcome the human and technological errors that had protected him for so long.
So Ridgway is in custody. The forensic evidence is just overwhelming. But the prosecution still had a major decision to make because Washington State had the death penalty as an option.
And that option became the central piece of leverage in the plea deal that was worked out in 2003. The prosecution had a choice. They could go for the ultimate penalty, which would mean years, maybe decades of appeals.
With no guarantee.
Right. Or they could use that threat to get something that the families desperately needed right now.
And that was closure.
That was closure. So in 2003, Ridgway agreed to a plea deal. His life would be spared, and in exchange, he would provide his full cooperation.
Which meant what specifically?
It meant confessing to every single act he was responsible for. And most importantly for the families of the missing, it meant leading investigators to the exact locations of the remains that had never been found.
For those families who had waited decades, just living in that awful uncertainty, knowing for sure must have been paramount.
It was everything. It was a terribly difficult calculation, but it prioritized giving those families finality over pursuing the maximum punishment. It was a different kind of justice.
And what followed was this chilling testimony. The confession process revealed someone who was just terrifyingly detached.
The sources describe how he recounted his acts, the strangulations, the disposal of the remains, with this methodical, clinical simplicity. No visible emotion. He confirmed why he chose his victims. He believed cynically that women involved in street activities wouldn't be missed quickly. He was exploiting those societal blind spots we talked about.
And the lack of remorse is what everyone always comes back to.
There was none. It was clinical. He talked about these events like they were routine tasks. He told them that taking lives wasn't about rage. It was a compulsion that it calmed him. It relieved some kind of internal pressure. That detachment was incomprehensible, even to hardened detectives.
When all the confessions were tallied, the sheer scope of it all became clear.
He pleaded guilty to 48 separate acts of taking a life. It made him one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history. And investigators believe the real number is probably higher, maybe over 70.
So some victims may never be found or linked to him.
That's the tragic reality. The plea deal, for all the closure it brought, is also an admission that we may never know the full extent of his actions.
The impact on the families hearing those confessions must have been just a second trauma.
A complete re-traumatization. They had to hear these horrifying details. But for dozens of families, it meant they could finally recover the remains of their loved ones. After decades of waiting and hoping, they could finally bring them home. It was an agonizing but necessary end to their search.
The resolution of this case became this huge moment of systemic reckoning. It forced everyone in law enforcement to look back and ask, Where did we go wrong?
And there were clear logistical failures, as we've said. The jurisdictional mess, the poor communication, that slowed everything down. But the deeper, more profound lesson was about the societal failure. That's the real legacy here.
The failure to value the victims' lives.
Absolutely. The fact that their disappearances were often dismissed or not treated with urgency, that proved the offender's cruel calculus was right. He knew their safety wasn't a priority for society. And investigators later had to admit that this systemic bias gave him the time and the opportunity he needed.
The scale of that failure basically demanded a complete overhaul of how these investigations are run.
It became the case study. It fundamentally changed how serial crimes are handled. The need for coordination, for multi-agency task forces, for shared databases, all of that came directly from the lessons learned here.
And the primacy of forensics, of course.
Oh, that was the clearest lesson of all. The preservation of forensic evidence became paramount. The message was clear. No case is ever truly cold if you collect and preserve the evidence correctly. This case proved that DNA analysis was the single most transformative tool in the history of modern law enforcement.
Ridgway himself also forced a change in behavioral profiling. He didn't fit the dramatic mold.
Not at all. He challenged every assumption from the 1980s. He wasn't some brilliant, charismatic mastermind. He was quiet, compliant, and deeply, deeply ordinary. This forced law enforcement to rethink how they assess threats.
They learned that the most dangerous individuals can hide in plain sight.
And that the best camouflage is often just banality.
So justice finally arrived, but it was born out of scientific necessity.
In December 2003, he was sentenced to life without parole. It came after weeks of incredibly powerful and emotional impact statements from the families. But you're right, justice arrived decades too late for dozens of people, and it was only achieved because science compensated for those earlier systemic failures.
The sources are really clear that the focus of this story shouldn't be on him, but on the victims and the system itself.
The true legacy belongs to them, to the human beings who were failed by circumstance and by silence. The changes that came after this were all aimed at making sure that future investigations begin with urgency, with empathy, and with an equal value for every single life. It's a permanent, painful reminder of the moral cost of neglect. And I think the core lesson here for you, the learner, is realizing that these complex, long-running problems, they often need solutions that don't even exist yet. This investigation wasn't solved in the heat of the moment. It was solved years later, when science had finally developed a precision to see what had been invisible to the human eye.
Yeah, it's a very sobering reminder, isn't it, that often the biggest dangers aren't lurking in the shadows. They're just blending into the mundane fabric of everyday life. We've seen exactly how technological limits and societal prejudice can create the perfect camouflage.
And that's why the ultimate focus really shifts away from the perpetrator and toward that systemic change. This case remains a cornerstone example of the moral cost of neglect and the ethical imperative to value and protect all lives equally, regardless of who they are.
So what does this all mean for you? Consider this. If a case this vast, involving dozens of victims and immense resources, hinged entirely on a scientific advancement that was 20 years away, what critical piece of evidence are current investigators handling today, meticulously preserving it in storage, the true significance of which we can't yet fully comprehend? Something to think about as you continue your own analysis of the world.